So, as Jonathan told us, we're talking about truth in incarnation and Eucharistic repetition. And the first question I want to pose is, can we speak of truth? To speak of truth appears to be too grand a venture. To speak of truth suggests that we know for certain. To speak of truth raises suspicion in the minds of speakers and listeners. Some say there is no such thing as truth, but to say this is itself a truth statement, and so a logically implausible argument. To argue there is no such thing as truth suggests that such a statement is in fact truer than the statement truth exists. The question of truth is one that has occupied the minds of philosophers and theologians for centuries, in the belief that if there is no concept of truth, we could not make any statements at all. So the thesis of this paper is that the coming of truth, in its power and its making people free, is not known by propositional means alone, but rather in relationship with the Word made flesh, Jesus Christ, his incarnation and Eucharistic repetition. God is known in Jesus Christ in John's Gospel and proclaimed as being the incarnate God. This is therefore not about knowing so much through information about Jesus Christ in an empirical or scientific sense, but rather the knowing of God through the being of Jesus Christ, ontologically, if you like, in a relationship that leads a person to truth. The way Christ's incarnate work functions in the world and among people leads to this knowing, as we see in John's Gospel. Christ brought truth into the world through his incarnate life of service, even to death and resurrection. And it is the Spirit's role to lead all people into that truth as they live in fellowship with God and one another. In the sense that we encounter truth in John's Gospel, truth is a matter of relationship between the incarnate Christ and those who follow him. It is not a thing or a proposition or a piece of knowledge, but a relationship. The distinction between truth as knowledge and truth as relationship is brought out powerfully in the interaction between Jesus and Pontius Pilate following Jesus' arrest. When Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate, Pilate asked him the question, "What is truth?" And Jesus prepared the way for Pilate's question about truth by saying that he was testifying to the truth, suggesting that his very incarnate presence was in fact the truth. This exchange is recorded in chapter 18 of John's Gospel, and really it discusses the nature of truth. So here we have this quote from John. Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" Now this suggests that those who listen to Jesus' voice and follow in his way belong to the truth as they enter into relationship with him. In John's Gospel, the witness of Jesus to truth can only be grasped by those related to Jesus and the truth that he is, and who in fact come to its light. Grasping this truth is about being in relationship with Jesus Christ. Pilate does not understand that. He does not understand this relationship and is concerned only with objective knowledge, even though the truth was standing right there in front of him. This truth, or in the original Greek text, aletheia, is, says C.K. Barrett, not mere knowledge of reality, dependent on subjective awareness and understanding, but truth in motion, in a living being who enters into the world, speaks to the world, and who liberates the world and those who hear and experience it. This suggests that those who hear the voice of Jesus as truth participate in the divine communion of love, as a relationship, in a way that points away from subjective and empirical understanding or mere knowing towards a more universal divine relationship. David Ford, calls this a habitus of blessing, which offers hospitality through what he calls the theological heart of non-identical repetition. And it's that concept of non-identical repetition that I want to focus on. What is the implication of that for sacramental theology? For David Ford, non-identical repetition involves the mediation of the transcendent in and through the immanent. That is, where there is universality bound up with particularity, where symbols participate in what they symbolise in a real way. David Ford argues that it is intrinsic to Christian faith, that it is true to itself only by becoming freshly embodied in different contexts, where there is the particularising activity of the Holy Spirit, a flourishing of distinctive and different realisations of the eventfulness of God. Indeed, Ford, speaking of the Eucharist, refers to this as an astonishing scandal of particularity, where the remembering of this person, Jesus, through this event becomes the context for one's vocation and the bond of one's community. In so doing, truth, as Catherine Pickstock points out, is found in the proportion between things and mind. This is so in the Eucharist, where the words of Jesus draw extraordinary attention to the bread and wine, where those elements are drawn into the drama of the occasion with the force of paradox or of the prophetic gesture, so that the realm of the ordinary has been taken up and involved in the most momentous events without rejection, contrast or competition between the two. Now, all this Ford links with the concept of non-identical repetition, as opposed, of course, to identical or strict repetition, where Ford says the Eucharist at its best has been a non-identical repetition, which is characteristically a Christian form of universality with particularity, and where the past is repeated in such a way that it is fruitful in a new way for the present and the future. This is indeed Pickstock's proportion between things and mind, which for the Eucharist involves the truth that things, such as bread and wine, manifest in a real manner to the communicant what they symbolise and what the mind comes to see as the body and blood of Christ. The paradox, of course, is that the symbol is not the symbolised in the strict or numerical sense of identical repetition. That means that bread and wine is not literal flesh and blood, but a real presence nonetheless, in such a way that the symbol operates in what David Ford is calling non-identical repetition. So truth as a proportion between things and mind, in the sense of non-identical repetition, or perhaps we could use the word participation, becomes a matter of ontological participation in the divine, where the blessing and the hospitality is non-identically repeated, such as in the Eucharist. Truth, therefore, is less about subjective understanding as knowledge, or the property of knowing, but the entering into of relationship where there is an ontological being of the incarnate Christ in the life of the person who listens to truth. That is Christ. And in so doing, the person belongs to and is sanctified in that truth. In this rather remarkable book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, McGilchrist sees truth as unconcealing, which is a progress towards something never fully seen, whereas truth as correctness is given as a thing in itself that can in principle be fully known. This means that to have the impression that one sees things as they truly are is not to permit them to presence to us, but to substitute something else for them, something comfortable, familiar and graspable. Signs working in the sense of non-identical repetition permit the grasping of presence through the use of signs that are comfortable and familiar, in the sense that signs function as an approximation in the way of non-identical repetition. Signs do not become what they symbolise in a strict or numerical sense, that is, identical repetition, such that bread, for example, becomes a piece of human flesh, or wine becomes a cup of blood, but signs which work in an ineffable and graspable sense, and which can be the vehicles of what they repeat non-identically. Signs, then, such as bread and wine of the Eucharist, convey the real presence of Christ's identity to the communicant in a way that conveys truth, just as the Incarnation does. The truth that makes us free and the truth to which we belong is a relationship by which we are sanctified through the power of the Holy Spirit. This leads us to consider what Catherine Pickstock, in her recent book that Wayne has brought to our attention in recent times, Aspects of Truth, a New Religious Metaphysics, speaks about the distinction between epistemological and ontological truth. And in this recent work, Pickstock is helpful here in distinguishing between these two categories, epistemological and ontological approaches to truth, arguing that truth in an epistemological approach becomes an object of knowledge or a property of knowing, whereas in an ontological approach, truth is a property of being. Now, in prioritising the ontological approach in a theological perspective, Pickstock calls attention to truth as proportion between things and mind. Such an ontological approach gives a high place to both things of this world and reflective mental processes, and as such has important ramifications for sacramental theology, in that it embraces both the use of outward signs and propositional reflection on those signs, that is, the proportion between things and mind. I think this is what McGilchrist is suggesting when he argues that to see things as they truly are, we need to substitute something else for them, something comfortable, familiar and graspable. The knowing of Christ in an epistemological and objective sense is indeed ungraspable. We cannot grasp or eat or drink the literal body and blood of Christ as a physical reality. All we have in the Eucharist are approximations of his presence with us, where the real flesh and blood is not graspable by the communicant in a literal or physical sense, as a strict and or identical repetition implies. This, of course, does not mean that we don't have a real presence of Christ. Indeed, I would argue we do, but it is a non-identical presence. In non-identical repetition, bread and wine are comfortable, familiar and graspable, conveying what they signify in a way that is real, life-changing, and the truth of Christ's real presence with his people. Truth, then, is not simply teaching, where the aim is to convey knowledge as matters of fact, or to have the correct mindset or propositional theological understanding in a purely mentalist conception, as some of our evangelical brethren might choose to do. Truth for Pickstock is only possible for God in human flesh, and so the Incarnation becomes hereby the precondition of truthfulness. The Word made flesh, the incarnate Christ, is therefore central to truth as a real life person, Jesus Christ, but is now known in the present in its Eucharistic repetition through the signs that allow for proportion between things and mind. For Pickstock, then, truth is always subjective. An approximately true life is one which participates in the life of the God-man through the sequence of apostleship. The ontological approach emphasises relationship and has important implications for sacramentality, and calls attention to truth in what Pickstock sees as the proportion between these things, such as sacramental signs, and the processes of one's mind. Sacramentality involving the use of signs and rational processes are therefore not in opposition to one another, but work together in the relationship which becomes the discovery of truth. Remaining in the truth means that one must repeat non-identically in order to be faithful to the truth. That is, the moment of incarnation. This implies that truth is found in graspable historical events, where there is conjunction between things and minds. Now, the Eucharist is such a place, as an historical event, where truth is found in ways that are forever new and involve an ontological bond between mind, matter and eternity, and where the comfortable, familiar and graspable signs of bread and wine disclose the hiddenness of Christ's real presence with his people, and so convey the power of his work through those outward forms. It is in the Eucharistic repetition, non-identically, that the truth of the Incarnation is disclosed and found. Truth, then, I am saying, is more than a set of ideas or factual knowledge. Even though Pilate, by his question, was seeking that sort of objective definition of truth, and imagining that such an objective definition was indeed possible. Rather, truth is a participation in the divine life of God and the incarnate Christ in an ontological sense, which involves the subjective nature of relationship. Jesus is not speaking of truth in the abstract, or the distinction between what is correct or false, but specifically in relation to his own presence and being in the incarnation, and the way that those who listen to him belong to and are sanctified in that truth in relationship with him. Pilate does not see this, and can only pose this abstract epistemological question of the mind. What is truth? Guessed at in that moment, and seeking, I suggest, an objective answer. Now, I think David Ford helpfully observes that focusing on Pilate's motives in asking this question about truth is the wrong way to go. He suggests that it is better to notice how this question works in its context. For Ford, in discussing the drama of the trial, the moment does not lead to any exposition in line with the truth that Jesus is. Ford observes that the irony is that Pilate, faced with the truth in person, is asking a what instead of a who question. And so for the Christian reader, the right question becomes, who is truth? In the drama of the trial, Jesus relies instead only on the reality of his eternal and objective presence, his ontology as truth, and makes no attempt to answer the epistemological question that Pilate asks. Jesus quite simply, by his own admission and presence, and in the context of standing in front of Pilate as the incarnate Son of God, is the truth, even if Pilate fails to realise it. The incarnate Jesus Christ is the proportion, then, between things and mind. It is this same proportion that is non-identically repeated in the Eucharist, as Pickstock argues, where the context is the habitus of blessing and hospitality in the scandal of particularity. So Pickstock, emphasising the objectivity of such a realist framework, criticises the type of theology that tries to ground belief in a surety of understanding, and yet has assumed that the guarantee of the purity of the objects of belief is their objective indifference to subjective inflection and shared affinity within the believer. For Pickstock, such an approach has impossibly attempted to ascend to the heavens, forgetting that Jacob's ladder must first be let down to us. The ladder of what Pickstock speaks is philosophical participation, theological revelation, where the reality of gift reveals more than itself and calls us back to the source of the giver. Such is the function of the Eucharist in the way it acts as proportion between things and mind, where truth as proportion between things and mind is found in the Incarnation and its non-identical repetition. If we look at the work of Rowan Williams, we find that he uses a sacramental poetic similar to this. It's a participatory, non-identical repetition, and argues that Christ's life and identity are strictly identical. Just say that again. Christ's life and identity, what Christ really is strictly identical in both himself and in the Eucharist. He's not saying that Christ is a piece of flesh in the Eucharist or a cup of blood. Whatever it is that Christ is, his life and identity is in both the signs of the Eucharist and the signified body and blood of Christ. So whatever Christ is, his life and identity is identical in both the elements of the Eucharist and in Christ's own very life and ontology. The particulars or the signs of the Eucharist, however, are the particulars of Christ's body, and the particulars of Christ's body and blood are not numerically or strictly identical, even though the signs share a strict identity of nature. So bread does not become flesh, wine does not become blood, but the signs contain in them whatever the life and identity of Christ is. Therefore, there is a strict identity of nature, but not a strict identity between the signs and the reality, if you understand what I'm trying to say. The life and identity of Christ, Christ's nature, are therefore to be found in both his literal body and blood and in the signs of the Eucharist. But the signs of the Eucharist, the bread and wine, can never be strictly identical with his literal body and blood in the sense that bread can turn into or be strictly identical with flesh and wine. The life and identity of Christ can, however, be present as a sacramental poetic, a non-identical repetition in the signs of the Eucharist. So Williams says in trying to, in excluding any type of fleshy realism implied by numerical or strict realism, while at the same time attempting to affirm the identity of nature as a sacramental poetic, says this: the force of the gospel text seems to be more to do with a kind of extension of the reality of Jesus' presence to the bread and wine. They too bear and communicate the life of Jesus, who and what he is. By eating these, the believer receives what the literal flesh and blood have within them: the radiant action and power of God the Son, the life that makes him who he is. So Williams is here embracing the proportion between things and mind in relation to Eucharistic theology, while at the same time advancing a realist participatory vision as an ontological approach to truth. It is in such an analysis of non-identical repetition that Christians are called to enact the whole action of the Eucharist, not simply as a memory of a past event or knowledge about Jesus, but rather as the making present of the Lord in the community of faith, where the effect of his death is made new again, what liturgical scholars call anamnesis, in and through signs in liturgical celebration and worship. This is what Ford calls the habitus of blessing, the offering of hospitality, received in the Eucharist, and which Ford and Pickstock call non-identical repetition. It is here that transformation occurs, as Christ the truth is relationally known in the non-identical repetition of the Incarnation, and received in a way that involves much more than mere knowledge of a past and completed event. So in conclusion, we can think, as Jesus stood before Pilate, he was the truth in his incarnate form. The same proclamation of truth is found, as Pickstock argues, in Incarnation and its Eucharistic non-identical repetition. The truth proclaimed in the incarnate Jesus and in the Eucharist involves this proportion between things and mind, such that in the Incarnation and Eucharistic repetition, the truth, that is Jesus Christ, is disclosed and found. Thank you.